2017 is finally over. Let's just take a minute to appreciate that. Hey guys, it's Hannah, and today I'm coming to you with a video that is my favorite video to film every year, and that is my favorite books of 2017. I think it's fair to say that globally, 2017 was a struggle, and I know for me personally, it definitely was as well. But although the year was a stressful one, I did read 17 incredible books in 2017. I could actually pick 17 of them, which makes me very, very happy. I read 52 books, and out of those 52, I loved the majority of them, and I'm really happy to say that. I read some of my favorite books of all time this year, and I'm so happy that I finally read these books and that they are part of my life, and I'm very excited to share them all with you, so hopefully you'll pick them up and you'll love them as well. So without any further ado, let's get into my top 17 favorite books of 2017. Number 17 on this list has to go to The Upside of Unrequited by Becky Albertalli. This is a YA contemporary novel that follows the story of this girl named Molly who has had 26 crushes to date, and all of them have been unrequited. It's kind of like a rom-com. It's a very funny book, and it's about Molly kind of dealing with this crush that she currently has. But at its core, this story is about much more than that. It has such a diverse cast of characters. Molly was raised by two moms, one of whom is Black. She has a Black half-brother. Her family is Jewish. Her sister is a lesbian, and it just has so much representation, and that made me really happy because this is truly reflective of the diversities that we have in this world and the diversities within families. The other thing I loved about this book was that it was just really funny. I could go from just feeling a lot of emotions on one page to suddenly laughing on the next page, and I always love whenever a book can do that. This was one of the first contemporaries I read this year, and I was kind of wary of the genre before that. I just didn't read it very much. There weren't many stories that intrigued me. I have a few favorites, but I was just never too into it. But after reading this one, I read so many more contemporaries this year, and a number of them are on this list because I just loved them so much. So part of the reason I like this book too is because it kind of opened that door for me, and it really made me kind of see what contemporary can really do and how much I actually do enjoy it. And so I'm very grateful to it for that. And that's one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite books I read in 2017. Number 16 on my list has to go to Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. This was one of my most highly anticipated releases of 2017, and it did not disappoint. This has to be one of my favorite Shadowhunter novels in general. It's just so good. So much happened, and I have so many feelings about it. If you'd like to hear more of my in-depth thoughts on this book, I do have a full, very long, spoilery discussion video of it up on my channel, so I'll leave that linked on the screen as well as down below if you'd like to go and check it out. But this book just completely blew me away. I fell in love with so many of the characters that we're introduced to in the first book. Lady Midnight was just okay to me. I expected to like it more than I did, but this one definitely blew me away. This was one that I deeply enjoyed, and it made me fall back in love with the Shadowhunter world, and now I'm just so much more invested. I feel like I'm back in 7th grade and I'm reading The Mortal Instruments for the first time again, and I'm just falling in love with it all over again. So I really enjoyed this one, and I cannot wait for Queen of Air and Darkness to come out this year because I know that that one is going to utterly destroy me. The next book on my list is actually a classic that I read this year, and that is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I read this as part of the Ostentatious book club that is run by Zoe from Read by Zoe. After reading this one, it became my favorite Jane Austen novel, and I love it so dearly, and it means so much to me, and I'm so happy that I read it. If you don't know the story, it's just in basic terms about these two sisters who are both in love with two different people, and it's about their relationship with one another as well as their relationships that they are trying to pursue, and it's just so good. It's dramatic, it's heartbreaking, it's heartwarming, it's funny, and it's just fantastic. I love Pride and Prejudice, don't get me wrong, but quite honestly, I think I actually prefer the movie of Pride and Prejudice more than I like the book. There's just something about the book that doesn't feel the same way as the film feels to me, but this one felt like the way that I wanted the Pride and Prejudice book to feel compared to the movie, if that makes sense. It's romantic and angsty, but then there's also the sister relationship in the story, which is so significant, and I just absolutely loved it, and honestly, I would reread this book over and over again because it was that good to me. The next book on my list has to go to The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This book has taken the world by storm. It has been on the New York Times bestsellers list since it came out, I believe, and it totally deserves that spot because it's fantastic. If you don't know, this book follows the story of this girl named Star Carter who witnesses her best friend be murdered by the police. It's a story that's inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. It's about activism, it's about police brutality, racial violence, across the hostility that we have in America and throughout the world in a lot of ways through the eyes of this 17-year-old girl. It's the type of book that you will read and it will definitely open your mind to a lot of things that you had not thought about before. One of the things I love about this book so much is that it was needed, and it's still needed. It's something that has an important message that is so impactful and so relevant and moving and powerful, and it's a story that needed to be told. The story itself is also just a fantastic contemporary. In every regard, it's about a girl who is going through a journey of learning more about herself and coming to terms with the world that she lives in and what she wants and who she wants to be. And it has a fantastic family, one of the best families I've ever read about in any YA contemporary. And there's humor and there's drama and there are tears, many, many tears. And it's just so, so well done. And I just loved it. I'm so happy for the success that this book has had. I cannot wait until the film comes out, and I just want everyone to read this book because it's definitely the type of thing that I think everyone needs to read. The next book on my list has to be Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. I've read both of Becky Albertalli's books this year, and I loved both of them so, so much. If you did not know, Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda is about this boy named Simon who is in the closet at school, so no one knows that he's gay, but he and this other boy who go to his school have been emailing back and forth, and he is also gay, except Simon does not know who he is. And then one day someone finds out about Simon and his emails and ends up blackmailing him using the emails and threatens to out him. And it's a really good story. It's really funny. It's really happy and light and fluffy and just pure and precious and good. And I loved every word. I actually ended up reading this book because I was invited to an early screening of Love, Simon, the film that's being adapted from this book. And so I read this book on my plane ride to the screening of the film, and then I watched the film right afterwards. And I cannot wait for the world to see this movie because it has meant so much to me. This book means so much to me, and I am so, so happy that I read it, and I'm so happy that it exists. That's how I feel about most of the books that I read this year. I'm just really happy that they exist and that I read them and that other people in the world have the opportunity to read these books because they just mean a lot, and I think that they're important books, and those are my favorite type of books. But back to Simon, like I said, it's just a fantastic story. It's about a boy who, again, is just trying to come to terms with himself while dealing with a really, really complicated situation. And it's just purely good, and that's what I love about it so much. And it makes me very happy. It's the type of book I can go back to and read over and over again if I just want to feel happy. And I really love when a book can do that for me, because sometimes some books that you really love, especially for me personally, can get really heavy and really dense. And I like something that can be light from time to time, so I can go back to that whenever I just need a little bit more light in my life. The next book on my list has to go to The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is a book that I had been wanting to read for several years, and I don't know why it took me so long to pick it up, but I finally did this year, and I fell utterly in love. Since 2018 has already started, I can tell you that I've already read the next two books in the series, and I actually love those two more than I love this one, but this one is still fantastic nonetheless. If you don't know, essentially the series is set in the 1920s in New York, and it's a paranormal fantasy series that follows the story of this girl named Evie who moves to New York, and she and her uncle and a couple of her friends end up having to solve these murders that have been taking place in New York by this serial killer named Naughty John. It's a lot more than that. There's so much to this series, and I just want everyone to read these books. Apart from the action-packed, fun fantasy plot that this series has in general, there are two things that I think make it extremely unique. First of all, it's very, very eerie and spooky. I read this book during October, and it was the perfect time to read it because it's very, very Halloween-esque. You get that eerie, haunted vibe from it for sure because it's kind of paranormal. It has to do with ghosts, and there's a serial killer, so you can kind of get that sense to it. And the second thing is that this book kind of reads like a history book at times, and I don't mean that in the sense that it's like boring and just kind of info dumpy. I mean that it gives you a lot of history about the US, and it does so mixed in with the fantastical elements, so you're getting actual historical facts with fantastical elements woven in, and it's so well done. I've truly never read anything like that before, and this book is just so incredibly unique because of it. The other thing I love about this series is how diverse the cast is and how diverse the setting is, even though it's just set in New York. The book actually takes place in different places in New York. So we have Harlem in the 1920s, we have Chinatown in the 1920s, and the book actually talks about what was going on in those places during that time period. There's Memphis, a black character in the book who lives in Harlem, and we get to see through him kind of like what his experiences are like. There is a Chinese character in the book who is actually half Chinese and half Irish, and she lives in Chinatown, and we get to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we get to see the influence of all of that. It talks about immigration, it talks about sexuality during the 1920s, it talks about so many different things, and it's just so well done. I cannot emphasize that enough. Truly, I think this is one of the most underrated YA book series. It deserves so much more attention and so much more hype, and I cannot wait to finish this series because I know it's going to destroy me and it's going to become one of my favorites of all time, if it isn't already. And it definitely is. The next book on my list is The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee. This book is a YA historical fiction novel that follows the story of this boy named Monty who is in love with his best friend Percy and basically has been his entire life. It takes place in like 1700 something, and it follows Monty's story as he and Percy and his younger sister all go on this kind of tour through the continent, basically most of Europe is what I'm assuming. And while they go on this tour, Monty kind of just has to deal with his feelings for his best friend. Monty's bisexual and he's been with a lot of girls and a lot of guys, but he's never liked anyone as much as he likes his best friend. And it's just such a good story. It's hysterical, truly one of the funniest books I've ever read in my entire life. So many quotable one-liners that I still quote to this day. Nobody knows what I'm quoting because not enough people have read this book, but I don't care. It's really funny and I love it. Not only is it hysterical, it's also heartbreaking. I also cried a lot in this book and I was not expecting to. And it also deals with a lot of really heavy topics. We get to see what it was like for someone who was bisexual in the 1700s. We get to see what it was like for Percy, who's half black, dealing with that in the 1700s in England. And I love getting those historical aspects in it as well because I love historical fiction. And I just love having that mixed in with such a funny and kind of light, even though it's not always light, story. Monty deals with a lot of homophobia in this book from his dad, from other people, and we get to see how he deals with that and copes with it as well. And I just loved that about it. It's so different from everything else I've ever read because I don't really see a lot of YA historical fiction, especially one that has a bisexual main protagonist, and it's just so refreshing to see that, and it made for such an enjoyable book. So if you haven't picked it up yet and you want something that's definitely going to be a very fun adventure and something that'll make you laugh and cry, I highly recommend trying this one out. And now finally we're getting into my top 10 favorites of the year. Of course, like I said, all of these are my favorites, but these are the top 10, so these are the ones that are most near and dear to my heart. And starting off that list is Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappia. Eliza and Her Monsters follows the story of this girl who is essentially famous on the internet for an online webcomic that she started. She has millions of fans and millions of followers, and one day at school, this new kid comes to town, and she ends up finding out that he is actually the most popular fan fiction writer for her webcomic. So she knows who he is, but he has no idea who she is because she's anonymous online, and then that creates some problems for them. That's basically the main surface plot of the story, but the story is truly about our main character, Eliza, dealing with her anxiety. As someone who also suffers from anxiety and understands how difficult it can be, I absolutely adored this book because it was so needed for me and I was so happy to find it. This, in my opinion, has one of the best portrayals of anxiety I've ever read in any YA book, and because of that, it really resonated with me. There was just so much about this book that was relatable for me because it's about this girl Eliza who has this online life, and as someone who also has an online life and understands the anxiety around that as well as just having generalized anxiety, it was unlike anything else because I've never read another book where a character has that similar situation. The only one I can think of is Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell because she also has her fanfiction that she writes and she's very popular online and she also has anxiety, but in my opinion, Eliza and Her Monsters is Fangirl but better. I also read Fangirl for the first time this year, and I actually really did enjoy that book as well. However, This was, I think, a better portrayal of anxiety because Eliza also goes to counseling and she goes to therapy in the book, and we get to see a little bit of that as well too, and I enjoyed that aspect of it, and I felt like this book actually discussed her anxiety more than Cath does in Fangirl. This is by no means me bashing Fangirl, like I said, I really loved that book as well, but in terms of the representation of anxiety, I think that Eliza and Her Monsters just does a fabulous job, and it really, really meant a lot to me, like I said. So if you personally deal with anxiety, or you know anyone who does, or you just want to read a book that just sounds really good, I highly recommend trying this one out because it's definitely worth picking up and you'll really enjoy the rest of the plot as well. Number 9 in my top 10 has to go to The Inexplicable Logic of My Life by Benjamin Alire Sands. I actually have a full book review for this book if you would like to go and see more of my in-depth thoughts on it. I'll leave it linked on the screen as well as down below. But if you didn't know, Benjamin Alire Sands is the author of Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which is one of my all-time favorite books, and so when I heard that he had another book coming out this year, I knew that I had to read it, and I was lucky enough to get an ARC and read it, and I did right when I got it, and it was so good. This book follows the story of this boy named Sal who was adopted by his single gay father into a Mexican-American family, and it's about his senior year of high school with his friend Sam, and the two of them just trying to get through life and trying to get through high school and just dealing with everything that comes with that. It's truly a story about identity, about family, about relationships, and it's just so beautiful. I cried my eyes out reading this book. It's heartbreaking, but it's also just such an important story, and I'd never read a book about a character who was adopted before either, so I really loved getting to read that. I also just love the characters in Sands' books because he just is so good at writing well fleshed out characters, and they feel like the real people that I have in my own life going through their own problems, and they feel like friends, and that's what I really like that he does with stories. And of course the writing, as always, was beautiful, so I highly recommend giving this one a try too. If you haven't tried out Aristotle and Dante either, read that one as well, or read this one first. I love both of them. They're both fantastic. You cannot go wrong. The next book on my list absolutely has to be An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. An Ember in the Ashes is actually a book that I was not planning on reading this year. I wasn't planning on reading it at all, actually. I had to read it because it was on the syllabus for my YA class that I took this past semester, and I read it for that, and I fell completely in love. This series is a high fantasy series that is set in a world that is loosely based off of the Roman Empire. So essentially we have like this empire that has conquered basically an entire continent, and they are now in power, and then there's a rebellion that is trying to kind of get them out of power because they've been so oppressive. The story follows this girl named Laia who poses as a slave to kind of infiltrate the empire in order to save her brother, and then we have our other character Elias, who is actually a soldier for the empire, who ends up meeting Laia throughout all of this, and there is romance, there is war, there's a lot of fighting, there's so much to this story, and it is so good. Like I said, I wasn't planning on reading this book because I didn't think that I was going to like it. I have no idea why I thought that, but for some reason I just wasn't really drawn to the synopsis from what I'd heard, and I was completely wrong, and I'm so happy that it was on this syllabus because I found a new all-time favorite, and I cannot think of a world where I don't have this book in my life now. I love a world that has a lot of depth and its own politics to it, and this one definitely does, and that's one of my favorite aspects of it. But personally, my favorite thing about this series is the romance, and I don't really like romances in books that often. There aren't too many that I really fall for. If there's a romance in a book, I don't usually hate it, but I don't usually care that much. But this time, I cared a lot, and there's a love triangle in this book, and usually, again, I hate love triangles, but this time, I did not hate it. I actually really liked it, and I have like a side that I really want to happen, and I haven't read the second book, so I don't know what happens next, but I love this relationship, I love these characters, and I am just so invested in this series now. That was one of the things with this book, I think, is that I haven't been invested in a book the way that I've got invested in this one in a very long time, and I think the fact that it was able to do that for me was just extremely rewarding, so that made me really love the book. But yeah, I highly recommend giving this series a try. It has fantastic characters, a ruined world that is so well crafted, and it's just a great story, and I cannot wait to continue on. The next book on my list of favorites absolutely has to go to Our Dark Duet by V.E. Schwab. I read both of the Monsters of Verity duology this year. I read The Savage Song, and then I read Our Dark Duet, and I loved both of them, but Our Dark Duet tore my heart to pieces. I can't say too much about this book because it is the second book in the series, but essentially in this world there are monsters, 3 types of monsters, and monsters are essentially created out of people doing violent acts. So if you murder someone, that will create a monster. And I don't want to explain too much about the world because I think it's better if you kind of go into it and not know too much about it, because it's kind of fun to just explore for yourself. But I adore the characters in these books, and this book was so unique, so different from a lot of other fantasy that I've read, because it kind of feels like sci-fi and a bit of dystopian, and it's just so well written and so well done, and Victoria Schwab literally never disappoints me. But right after I read this, I immediately just wanted to read it again. It quickly became one of my favorite books in any series that I've ever read because it's just such a good conclusion. It definitely leaves you wanting more, and I could definitely get more, but it's also really satisfying. In my opinion, I know a lot of people thought that it wasn't satisfying, but for me personally, I thought it was very satisfying, and I'm just begging for more, but at the same time, I'm so happy with what we got. The next book on my list has to be Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This book came out in 2017, and I was so excited for it to come out because I love the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy, so when I heard that she was coming out with a new book, I knew that I had to read it, I knew that I was going to love it, and I was not disappointed. I adore this book. Strange the Dreamer is a high fantasy novel that follows around our main character named Laszlo Strange. And Laszlo is a librarian, and he has always been, ever since he was a child, fascinated with the forgotten city of Weep. Weep is a city that has been forgotten throughout time. The name of the city has actually been forgotten, and it has just been dubbed the Forgotten City of Weep. And Laszlo, like I said, has always been fascinated with it, and he studied it for his entire life. And then one day he finally gets the opportunity to actually go to the city and see it for himself. And I'm not going to say anything else because I don't think you need to know anything else. I think that you should just experience this story for yourself because it is so magical and so fantastic and beautiful, and I adore it, and I want everyone to read it. Basically, if you like fantasy, you'll love this book because it is so magical and it has a great romance. Again, another book that had a fantastic romance that I was not expecting to fall for, but I totally did. The writing is lush and lyrical and beautiful, as Laini Taylor's writing always is, but in this one I think especially so, and I just adored it. I cannot express how enjoyable this book was for me to read. It's truly everything I like about fantasy, and I think anyone else who loves fantasy will also really enjoy it as well. So the next 3 books on my list actually are all part of the same trilogy, and each of them I'm counting as one book because honestly each of them was a favorite, but I'm also just going to show the whole series at the same time because it's easier to talk about them like that. And that of course is none other than the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab. I read this entire trilogy for the first time in 2017, and it has become, I think I can safely say, my favorite trilogy of all time. It is so good. I am so in love with it, and it means everything to me. If you don't know, this is an adult fantasy series that takes place in a world where there are these magicians called Antari, and Antari have the ability to travel between different parallel worlds. And in this universe, there are 4 parallel versions of London, and each one is based off of a color. So we have White London, Red London, Black London, and Grey London. And our main character, Kel, is an Antari who has this ability to travel between the different Londons. And I don't want to say anything else about it, again, because I think it's another series that you shouldn't know too much about apart from just the general synopsis, and you should absolutely just explore for yourself because it's such a fun adventure and it's so magical and the characters are so well written and it's everything that you could ever want out of a fantasy novel. Victoria Schwab has quickly become one of my favorite authors of all time. I got the opportunity to actually interview her for her Conjuring of Light tour that she went on this year, and that was one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. I actually have book reviews for the first and second book. If you'd like to see any more of my thoughts on those books, I'll definitely leave them linked on the screen as well as down below. I still haven't done a review of the third book yet, which I'm definitely planning on doing, so I will be doing that, but I have those 2 reviews if you'd like to go see them. But nonetheless, this is just a fantastic series, and truly I can say the closest any series has ever come to Harry Potter for me. This series feels so much like Harry Potter to me, and I can't explain why, it just does. It's nothing like Harry Potter, there's no magical school, it's nothing like that, but for some reason I get that same warm, fuzzy feeling when I read them, and I love it for that. And finally, we are on to my last two books on my list of favorites of the year, and number 2 has to go to The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. This is a book that people had been telling me to read for I think like 3 to 4 years maybe, and I still hadn't read it. I don't know why, but this year I finally picked it up and finished the whole thing, and I'm so sad that I didn't read it earlier because it's so good and I am in love. The Shadow of the Wind is a historical fiction novel that takes place in Spain during the time of the Spanish Civil War, and it takes place over a span of, I believe, around like 50 years. The main story follows this boy named Daniel, whose father takes him to the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, which is essentially this library, and he asks him to pick out any book in the library. And Daniel ends up picking up this book called The Shadow of the Wind by Julian Carax. And Daniel reads the book and he falls in love with it, and he wants to read more of Carax's books until he finds out that all of his books have actually been burned, and The Shadow of the Wind is one of the only remaining copies of any of his novels. And then the story basically follows Daniel as he tries to uncover the mystery of what has been happening to Carax's books and why someone has been burning them. And there's so much more to it than that. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's so well written and just such an incredible story. It's a very difficult book to read, I will definitely give you that preface. There's a lot of difficult topics. It's set during a wartime, so there's violence, there's gore, it's very brutal at times, so definitely be aware of that before you go into this book. It's not something that's light by any means. It's a very heavy book, but it is absolutely worth reading if you can deal with that. I know that this is going to be a book that I reread over and over and over again. And I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who pushed me to read this book so much. I owe it to you because I definitely should have read it sooner. I should have listened to you. And finally, we are on to my very last book on my list, my favorite book that I read in 2017. I've mentioned it in several other videos at this point. Everyone probably already knows what book this is going to be, but nonetheless, the book is, of course, Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. Like I said, this is my favorite book that I read in 2017. That does not mean I think it is the best book that I read in 2017, because there are actually some books that objectively I think are better than this book in terms of their plot or writing or whatever else, like Shadow of the Wind. Technically, objectively, I could say it's better. But from a personal standpoint, from a very subjective standpoint, this book is my favorite book I read this year. It's the best book I read this year because it meant so much to me. If you don't know what this book is about, it follows the story of this girl named Asa Holmes who struggles with anxiety as well as OCD. And in terms of the plot, she ends up reconnecting with one of her old friends from childhood whose father is actually this billionaire who has recently gone missing, and the plot is kind of them trying to uncover what has happened to her friend's father. And that's just kind of the surface level of it. At its core, the book is really about Asa coming to terms with and learning how to live with her mental illness. This is one of the books that I read at the exact right moment in my lifetime. I needed this book at the time that it came to me, and because of that, it has meant so incredibly much to me. I don't even know how to emphasize that. I actually ended up listening to the audiobook of this first. I listened to it on a plane ride as I was coming back home, and I was sobbing the entire ride home because it was just breaking my heart because it resonated with me in such a deep, personal way. And then when I got home, I dropped off my bags in my apartment, I ran to the bookstore, bought a finished copy of the book, and then I just sat at home and that same day reread the book over again because I loved it that much. As someone who struggles with anxiety personally, the thing I loved about this book was that it completely understood me, and that feeling is honestly inexplicable, and I want everyone to be able to experience that. I want everyone to have something that they can look at and say, this is me, this is my mirror, this is what I feel, because that feeling is so validating and so reassuring, and it was something I needed, and I'm so happy to have found it in here. I get very, very emotional talking about this book, so I can't talk about it for too much more, but I will be doing a completely just spoiler-filled review of it where I go in depth and talk about all of my thoughts. So I know I've said that I'm gonna do it several times, but I've already planned it out, and it will be coming to you very soon, so you can be on the lookout for that if you want to hear more of my thoughts on this book. But I highly recommend giving this book a try. Be aware before going into it it. It can be very triggering at times, especially if you deal with anxiety or if you deal with OCD. I would definitely say be cautious before you go into it, but in my opinion, it is absolutely worth it and one of the best representations of mental illness I have ever read. Alright guys, so that is it for my list of top 17 books I read in 2017. Like I said, I absolutely adored every single one of these books. They've all meant so much to me, they've all been so fantastic, and I'm so glad that I got to read so many fantastic books this past year. Let me know in the comments down below if you read any of these same books, if you enjoyed them as well, or what any of your other thoughts were on them, and also let me know what your top 3 favorite books were that you read in 2017, because if I haven't read them, I will definitely add them to my list to read for 2018. I also just want to say thank you to all of you for making 2017 one of the best years of my life. Even though it was honestly one of the worst years of my life, it was also one of the best years of my life because of you all, because of everything you've done for me, because of all of your support, because of the love that you show me, the kindness that you show me. It means the world to me, and I truly cannot express that enough. You guys have made my life so much better, and there's nothing I could ever do to repay you for it, and I just love you all so dearly. So I'm sorry to get really sappy at the end of this video, but I just really wanted to say that. If you'd like to follow me on any of my social media, all of my links are in the description box as always, but thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you have a wonderful beginning of the year, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!